Today's story for the Owen McKiernan Library at the virtual Celtic Junction is going to be the first of a series of stories. This is a lovely book that we got when we visited Newgrange up in the Boyne Valley, and it's a book with some classic Irish myths, Irish legends, Newgrange, Tara, and the Boyne Valley. This is by Eithne Massey, illustrated by Lisa Jackson, and publisher is the O'Brien Press in Dublin. The very first one, actually, there's a gorgeous map at the beginning. It talks about the origin of the Boyne River. So take a look at this map. This shows some of the great places of the Boyne Valley. You can see the river just here. And the origin stories for how they work into Irish mythology. So they're a little bit shorter, which is good. Because I think some of ours have been long, but here we go. Story number 1, How the Boyne was Born. This is a story about a princess. It is also a story about a well. The well was called the Well of Wisdom. Nuts fell from the 9 magic hazel trees that grew over it. The nuts contained all the knowledge in the world. A salmon swam in the well and swallowed the nuts. But no one was allowed to look into its dark depths but Necton, the greatest magician in the land. He was a king, and he was also the chief of the druids who guarded the Well of Wisdom. There's Necton, the hazel trees, the salmon, and there he is swimming. And the princess. Her name was Boyne. Although she lived in a beautiful palace, she was a very bored princess. She wasn't allowed to run or jump. She was supposed to sit quietly and not ask any questions. She spent every day sitting and sewing with her ladies-in-waiting. Whenever she asked a question, they said, "Princesses don't need to know that." She looks very cross. But Boyne wanted to know about the places beyond the palace walls. She wanted to see the sea and the mountains, the fields and woods, and meet lots of people. One day, Boyne was feeling especially bored. She walked restlessly round and round in her room. Her one friend in the whole palace, her dog, Dabila, watched from her cushion. Boyne told Dabila everything. Now she plucked her little dog up from her cushion and whispered, "We are going to visit the Well of Wisdom." Dabila barked sharply. She knew that Boyne was not supposed to go near that well. Boyne held up Dabila so she could look into her eyes. "You don't think it's a good idea, do you?" she said. Dabila barked sharply again. These dogs know best. She kept barking as Boyne carried her to the grove of hazels. She barked even louder when Boyne lifted the heavy wooden cover of the well. She pawed at Boyne frantically when the princess looked down into the water. It was the darkest and the deepest well in the world. For a moment, as Boyne looked in, there was a great stillness. She could see her own face peering back at her from the depths. Then there was a flash of silver fin, a rushing movement. The water swirled. As Boyne watched, all the knowledge in the well rose towards her in a dark green wave. The water kept rising higher and higher. Dabila was barking madly now. Boyne shivered. She tried to push the wooden cover back over the well, but it was too late because the water was pouring over the edge. The rushing wave knocked her off her feet. She had just time to clasp Dabila in her arms before she was swept away. You see, there's Dabila. And the salmon looks like it's coming straight out too. We'll see him in another story. Necton and the druids ran toward the well. They looked on in horror as the water carried Boyne along. She was battered against trees and rocks. She clutched Dabila harder to her. She wasn't bored now. She was terrified. The wild waters carried her past the palace. She saw her ladies, their mouths open in horror. The ladies dropped their sewing and started to scream, but Boyne could not hear them. Her ears were full of rushing water. Her mind was filling up with all the knowledge of the world. Goodbye, she called to the ladies. No more sewing. And now she was no longer scared. Mile after mile, further and further, the water traveled, moving faster and faster, curving around mountains, cutting through plains, carrying everything with it. Boyne saw hills and houses in the wonderful world outside her palace walls. "Hello, world," she called. Now the sea was ahead of her, the mighty kingdom of McKiernan. She could see his seahorses galloping towards her, their white manes streaming over the crests of the waves. "Hello, sea," called Boyne. Boyne realized that the water was not carrying her any longer. She was the water. Inside her was the knowledge she had looked for, and she was inside the flow of the knowledge. She was Boyne, the river Boyne, the river Boyne. Boyne had become the goddess of the river. Her voice was the river's voice. And what of her little dog? Faithful Dabila became a rock on the seashore, just where Boyne runs into the ocean. She is so happy to be close by her mistress forever. You can see her still. You see the rock? Shaped like a dog. So there's the origin myth, or a telling of the origin myth of the Boyne River in the Boyne Valley. We'll have more of those adventures this week in Irish Legends.